Welcome back. So in this lesson, we're going to start discussing completing the square. So if you take a look today, our learning target is we're going to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. Now, we're actually going to start with a simpler method first. We've already learned how to solve by factoring. The second method we're going to cover quick before completing the square is called solving by square roots. Now this is a unique one. It only works in certain cases, just like factoring. It only works when the equation doesn't have the x term in it. It only has the x squared and the constant. That's going to be the only time that you can use this method to solve. And what are we going to do to solve them this way? Step one, you want to isolate the square term. So get the squared term by itself. And then you want to square root both sides. Now, the key to this is make sure you remember there's a negative and a positive answer. So let me clarify what we mean by when we do that. So first of all, step one, isolating the squared term. So that means I have to move this 81 over to the other side. So I'm going to get x squared equals 81. How do I undo a square? Well, to undo a square, that's where you do a square root. So this is where step two comes in. Take the square root of both sides, and you get x equals. Now, you know the square root of 81 is 9. However, remember in blue, there's a negative and a positive answer. Remember, to these quadratics, we're getting two solutions. So we're not just getting 9, we're getting positive or negative 9. When you're solving an equation by taking a square root, you have to make sure that you get both pieces, the plus and the minus. All right, our next one. Again, the goal is still first, isolate the squared term. So I'm going to add 72 to both sides. Now this one has an additional step. My squared term still isn't by itself quite yet. Now we're going to have to divide by 2 first. So I divide both sides by 2. So I get x squared equals 36. Now I'm to the point that I'm ready to take the square root of both sides. And again, hopefully you remember square root of 36. Well, square root of 36 is 6. However, we need to be getting two solutions. So we need to remember we take the plus or minus of that 6 to get that answer. So, pretty basic when you're dealing with the perfect squares. However, I also need you to remember from Expo, what happens if we don't necessarily get the nicest number? So, let's look at what happens in this next example. Again, I still want to isolate that squared term, so I'm going to add 150 to both sides. Going to divide by 3, so I get x squared equals 50. So, when I take the square root of both sides, note this time, square root of 50 isn't a nice number. That's not a perfect square. So we need to remember a technique from Expo. Remember, we have a list of perfect squares. These are all the nice numbers that you can square root and still remain with an integer. And remember what you want to do. You want to pull out the largest one that divides that number. So I look on that list and ask myself, what's the largest one that divides 50? Well, I see 25 on that list. So remember what that means is I'm going to split this up. So 50 is 25 times 2. And I know that the square root of 5, or the square root of 25 is 5. So I do want you to reduce your radicals into simplest form, okay? So there's the basics of how I can solve quadratics using square rooting. But again, this only works when you have the squared term and the constant term. Well, then you might be asking yourself, what do I do if I can't factor? And what do I do if I have that x term, if I can't use square rooting? Well, this is where our third method comes in, all right? Our third method will work on any quadratic, all right? It'll always, always work. So that's kind of a nice feature. Now, in order to complete the square, the first thing we have to do is calculate that term right there. Okay, that's going to be our key. So remember I told you to get the vertex, you need that negative b over 2a? Well, here's another little formula to remember to help you in this process of completing the square. All right, so that's going to come in just a moment. But let's start with step 1. So when I'm completing the square, you want to move the constant to the opposite side of the equation. So you want to get the constant alone. So in this case, that means I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So I'm going to have x squared minus 4x equals minus 2. All right? So actually the opposite of what we usually do with factoring. With factoring, we want to get everything to the same side. With this, we want to get that on the other side. We want to get it by itself. Because now I'm going to get that special term. So you know the b term. The b term is the term that's with the x. So in this case, my b is going to be negative 4. So if I want to take b divided by 2 and square it, that's going to be the key to solving this. So what's negative 4 divided by 2? Well, negative 2. And what's negative 2 squared? Well, negative 2 times negative 2 gives me a positive 4. So once I calculate that little bit right there, now I'm going to add that to both sides of my equation. All right, so I'm going to have x squared minus 4x plus 4. But then I can't just add it to one side of the equation. I want my equation to still be equal. So I add it to both sides of that equation. And I end up with this. The nice thing is we can make it look a little bit nicer because we know that negative 2 plus 4 is going to give us a positive 2. So this is what we have so far. Now the reason this is so important, the reason that we chose that 4 is because that actually factors. X squared minus 4x plus 4. Well, to get the x squared term, we have x and x. We want it to multiply to positive 4 and add to negative 4. Well, to multiply to a positive, add to a negative, we need 2 negatives. And if you choose x minus 2 and x minus 2, that's what you end up with. All right, so factoring is still a key to this one. Okay, and once you do that, I want you to notice the really special thing about this is you should always get 2 of the same thing. Again, that's the magic of using that b over 2 squared. You should get 2 of the same things when you factor. That's why we call it a perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to rewrite that as a square. Something times itself is squared. Okay, so now we have this. Well, now we have to finish solving it. Well, the way we finish solving it, you have to square root both sides. Okay, because square rooting will undo a square. So now over here, all I have left is that x minus 2. Taking a square root will undo a square. They cancel each other. And then on this side, well, square root of 2 isn't a nice number. So all I have left is plus and minus square root of 2. Because again, remember, when solving quadratics, when you square root something in an equation, remember you always get the plus and the minus. And then I need the x by itself. So I'm going to add that 2 over. Well, those are not like terms, so I can't combine them. So all I can do is leave them in this form. 2 plus or minus the square root of 2, and that's going to be my answer. So, a lot of steps. Not horrible, okay, but it's a lot of steps that you need to remember how to do. So let's work through another example together. to really try to help this make sense. So, reviewing that process of completing the square. Step 1, you want to move the constant to the other side. So I'm going to add that 3 over. Step 2, we need to identify that special term, that b over 2 squared, because that's what I'm going to add to both sides. B is always a term with the x, so I'm going to get 6 over 2 squared. Well, 6 over 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. So that special term I'm going to be adding to both sides is 9. So let's take a look at this. X squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 3 plus 9. So I add it to both sides. Let's clean that up. Step 3. Step 3 now says what you have left should factor. So x squared plus 6x plus 9. Now again, I'm not going to spend too much time on the factoring process here. We already spent a lot of time on that back in section 4, so I'm going to assume that you know how to get x plus 3 and x plus 3. Because 3 times 3 is 9, and 3 plus 3 is 6. Now, the unique thing that always happens when this is done right is you get 2 of the very same thing. So because I got 2 of the very same thing, I'm going to write it in its squared form, okay? X plus 3 times x plus 3 is the same thing as x plus 3 quantity squared. And now that I've done that, now I can start actually solving this, because the fourth step is now we start square rooting. So I'm going to square root both sides, because a square root undoes a square. So all I have left is x plus 3 on that side. Then remembering the plus and minus, I get that. All right? Need to get the x by itself. The ultimate goal here is to get the x by itself. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. And since those are not like terms, when I subtract 3, it stays completely separate. Doesn't end up combining with that 12. Now, just like in the beginning of this lesson when we were doing solving by square rooting, I need you to remember how to simplify radicals. So I need you to remember this 12 right here. That splits up. You can pull a 4 out of that 12. All right. Remember, if you can pull a perfect square out of a square root, you need to do it. You need to simplify this, because we know that the square root of 4 gives us 2. And so this is going to be the most simplified form of my answer. All right. You need to absolutely get it into the simplified form. Otherwise, it's not going to be quite finished. So there's another example of our process, okay? But this time at the end, adding that skill of if you can simplify radical, you need to make sure to do so. I have two more examples, for us to go through. So note the x squared term cannot have a coefficient. It can't have anything with it. So if it does, you need to make sure to get rid of that, all right? So in this case, my x squared has a 2. So I'm going to divide this whole equation, everything in this equation, I'm going to divide by 2 because I don't want that with my x squared. And now that I've done that, now I'm ready to finish solving via completing the square. Now this time I don't have all the steps labeled out for us, so let's just make sure we can run through and do each of those steps. So step 1. Step 1 says move the constant over. So I'm going to add that 3 to the other side. So that's my step 1. Remember, step 2. Step 2 says I need to find that b over 2 squared. So negative 2 squared is 4. So remember, step 2 is I need to add that 4 to both sides. Oh, I'm sorry. I can clean it up a little bit. Step 3 is where I factor. Okay? Step 3 is now I'm going to turn this into x minus 2 times x minus 2. That's the factored form of that quadratic. Remember, when this is done right, you will always be able to write it as such, okay, in its squared form. Step number 4 is finally to solve. So, square root both sides. And remember, square rooting undoes the square, and then you always need that plus and minus whenever you do so. Now add the 2 to the other side. And here is your answer. All right, so making sure we go through every single time that 4-step process. All right. Well, what about this one? What if there's a negative sitting out front? Well, what I want you to remember is if there's a negative sitting out front, to get rid of that, you can divide everything by -1. Now, the cool thing is, dividing by -1, all it really does is flips the sign of everything. And so you end up with that, right? But that's your technique. If you have a negative sitting out with the x squared, well, just divide everything by -1 and it'll get taken care of. And now we can start our 4-step process. So get the constant to the other side. So I'm going to add that 4 over to the other side. Step 2, I need to find that b over 2 squared. So there's my b. So b over 2 squared, 4 squared is going to give me 16. So I add that to both sides of my equation. And then I can clean it up. All right, I'm going to combine that 4 and the 16 to give me 20. Once you've done that, the 3rd step is factoring. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on that because we should have mastered that back in section 4. So we get to here. And the awesome thing about this factoring, you should always end up with 2 of the same thing. So I'm going to write it in its squared form. Now, step 4, I can take the square root of both sides and start solving. So, square rooting undoes the square, and make sure to take the plus and minus, and I subtract the 4 over to the other side. And this is one of those instances, as remember I said, if you get a radical that can simplify, my expectation is that you do it. So I need you to simplify this radical. You need to split that 20 up. 4 pulls out of 20. So pull out that perfect square. So you can simplify it to 2 square roots of 5. This is the answer that I need to see. All right, so there we have it. So again, write me a summary now. So we've gone through our learning target of completing the square, And then we had that little beginning talking about solving by square rooting. So I want you to write me a summary now. Summarize what we talked about, even maybe the differences and why you would use one over the other, just whatever you want to do to communicate your knowledge of this section to me. Make sure you take a couple moments here and write that down, then come back to class tomorrow ready to do your practice work.